Good. Everyone, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where on the world you are. Great to have you with us. Welcome to this Ask the Author webinar organized by the International Transport Forum for, I hope, your benefit. My name is Michael Claude. I'm the head of communications of the ITF, and I'm extremely pleased to have you with us. Today, we will take you through the findings of a new report that we published last day of February called Shaping Post-COVID Mobility in Cities. And I think most of us have been through pretty much a roller coaster ride since the early 2020 when the pandemic hit in terms of how we move around cities and how we work. I live in Paris and I'm a cyclist, and I used to be a fish all alone in the sea of cars. Then suddenly I had all the space in the world, all the streets were mine and that of other cyclists that joined me. And since the pandemic has come to not an end, but sort of petered out a little bit, the cars have come back, but the bicycles are still there. So the question is a little bit, is that the new normal, or what is the new normal, or is there a new normal? And what does it mean? What does it mean for urban mobility? What does it mean for policymakers, for transport planners? And that is some of the questions that we try to tackle in this report. And I am totally delighted to have with me Malithi Fernando, who's the author of this report, and will take us through the findings in just a minute. Before I hand over to her, I would just really like to acknowledge two people. That is Maria Santos Alfageme, who's the co-author and who's with us, I think, in the audience, and also Rhonda Glazer-Monk of the Department for Transport in the UK, who is the chair of the round table, the group of experts that we convened to create the basis for this report. So thank you very much for your great contribution to this. Now this is about you and about questions. So we try to keep the presentation short so you can ask questions, and please start to do that even during the presentation. Use the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of your screen, that little bubble icon, and type in any question that you want to ask so that we can start immediately after the presentation to quiz our author. And of course, you can continue to do that as we progress. And with that, I hand over to Malithi. Thank you very much for being with us. And over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. As Michael said, my name is Malithi Fernando, and I had the pleasure of writing this report alongside Maria. The findings of this report are a result of an expert roundtable that we held last year, where we had experts from over 20 countries spread over 6 continents, as well as the extensive research that was done since then. So in this study, we covered as wide a breadth of possible of issues pertaining to or challenges pertaining to urban transport, drawing from global examples. But this presentation is just going to skim the surface. We will highlight the 8 lessons learned that I have on the screen here that we learned during COVID-19, and based on these select lessons, discuss the policy directions that we see as imperative, not just to recovering but transforming our urban transport systems in the context of COVID-19, but then also the many other crises that we're currently seeing coincide with recovery. So let's get into this. What have we learned from the pandemic? Well, number one, policy is very powerful. We have never seen such sweeping changes as we saw in our travel behavior across the globe as those in response to COVID-19 policies. This also means that it's the perfect time to influence decisions as we're rethinking, reforming many of these habits. However, it's very important not to forget that personal factors such as level of household risk, trust in the government, and people's personal socioeconomic circumstances also played an incredibly big role in determining people's willingness and ability to follow these government policies. Travel demand is still changing and it remains in flux. We saw walking and cycling gaining popularity in many cities, but this wasn't the case everywhere. Cities where safe infrastructure was lacking did not necessarily see such an uptick. We have reports from the US where we are seeing reports of trip rates returning to normal, but in some cases, shorter trips have become more common. A lot of cities have reported traffic levels that are kind of at pre-pandemic norms, but we also have examples where road traffic is exceeding pre-pandemic levels on weekends. We've also seen changing levels of confidence with respect to returning to public transport. Early in the pandemic, a survey from New Zealand found that people were quite reluctant, but this has improved in subsequent studies. So long story short, we've seen travel patterns are changing. They're different from before, but they're still very much unstable. One of the most important lessons we learned, or at least what was made more clear, was the trips that our transport systems prioritize, and then by extension, the types of people we prioritize. On the public transport side, we often tend to prioritize rapid transit options rather than the humble bus. Rapid transport typically serves peak hour commuters destined for central business districts. However, during the pandemic, while rail-based modes remained depressed, bus ridership was consistently performing closer to pre-pandemic levels. This is because our most essential workers in healthcare and other service industries rely on buses, and so do lower income workers and women more often, who are overrepresented in these essential sectors. Next, when we consider how urban space is allocated, we realized when traffic levels dropped just how much of our cities are reserved for cars. So this was basically a global pilot for more people-centric cities with road closures, pedestrianization, widening of footpaths, and pop-up cycling infrastructure. So it's good lessons learned. Our report also takes a closer look at work-related travel, and we find that hybrid work is generally expected to continue, though this is available to a minority of the population. And of course, it depends on many factors, including access to the required infrastructure, work culture. It isn't necessarily going to result in more sustainable travel habits, though, and so this is a big area for policy intervention. And lastly, local authorities really did perform admirably on the whole, acting quickly and adapting to the ever-changing context, but they were only able to do so with the support of their national governments. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to walk through some of these lessons, kind of one or two at a time, and discuss the recommendations that we can derive as a result of them. To start, how do we approach policymaking given the state of flux that we are in? Well, for starters, we cannot expect a new normal. There is no new stable policymaking environment that we can really wait for. Our policies need to account for the uncertainty, which makes it a perfect time to adopt a decide and provide approach to policymaking. Rather than forecasting demand and then providing enough capacity to minimize congestion, which is our traditional predict and provide approach, decide and provide means that policymakers lead rather than respond to change. We could never have forecasted the ability of people to change their travel patterns as drastically as we saw during the pandemic. So I think the message here is be ambitious. These policy visions need to focus on improving residents' access to opportunities rather than greater mobility. We really recognized how much we had access to or didn't have access to while we were forced to stay closer to home the last few years. But even more so, we learned the value of the virtual dimension of accessibility. One study from Bangladesh found that trip frequencies actually did not drop in their sample if they consider virtual travel and virtual access to opportunities during the pandemic. Of course, this still requires broadband infrastructure, the competencies to use technology, and not all trips can be replaced, but it is still an important dimension to consider and can improve access for some services. Our next set of recommendations take a look at our transport systems and the people that we serve. First, we need to decentralize our transport systems and therefore diversify the trip types and the user profiles that we serve. Commutes make up a minority of all trips, but during the pandemic, we saw the importance of care work and care trips. They continued, and we really saw the demands that caregivers have. Women in some parts of the world reported feeling more unsafe on public transport due to low passenger volumes, while in other parts, the lack of crowding meant that women reported feeling safer. Users with disabilities also faced additional hurdles accessing services or accurate information on changing services. So we still have a ways to go in better serving all our users. But how we do this is not through traditional mass public transport alone. It's simply not economically viable to assume that. What we need is flexible multimodal networks that allow us to go from essentially everywhere to everywhere, something that right now people feel is only achieved through car ownership. So this means connecting to micromobility, shared mobility, demand responsive options. Informal public transport or popular transport already functions as this in many cities around the world. They filled gaps in formal public transport modes during the pandemic when those modes were services were shut down, and they're clearly an integral part of this overall transport network. Now, public transport will of course be the backbone, these mass transport services, but to remain so, authorities really need economic stability. This in the very short term will look like funding to ensure that services are not cut and we don't lose riders. But in the long term, this means moving to more sustainable revenue streams. This is the sole focus of an ITF working group right now on funding the future of public transport. So I won't go into too much more detail. The findings will be available later this year. On the subject of informal public transport, on the other hand, it is a wholly fare-dependent service, which meant there were severe economic consequences for drivers during the pandemic. In the report, we discussed some examples, in particular of implementing service contracting in the Philippines during the pandemic to both support drivers with an income based on the services they provide, but then also improve the services for the users. So this brings me next to active travel and micromobility and some takeaways on that front. We need to ensure that we don't simply undo the temporary infrastructure that was installed, I should say. This doesn't mean make all the pop-up lanes permanent. If they were built based on existing, well thought out plans for complete networks, then great, yes. But in some cities, they were more ad hoc and perhaps not as fit for purpose. In that case, adjustments should be made to increase the network footprint and consider their connectivity to things like public transport. But infrastructure is not the only policy lever we have. Any policy to deprioritize space for cars or reduce our dependency on cars, on the flip side, means a more suitable environment to encourage these lighter modes. So in many cities, we saw, for example, parking spaces converted to outdoor terraces to support restaurants during the pandemic. In Paris, by popular demand, this has become permanent. Businesses can apply for a summertime or even a year-long permit to convert parking spaces in front of their businesses. So we're seeing that there's even demand from businesses for these kinds of measures. Lastly, and most importantly, the success of these measures really do need the support of residents. We highlight some lessons learned from schemes that faced backlash in the report and what we can learn from them. Cities that deployed pop-up infrastructure under existing long-term visions were more likely to keep or upgrade to permanent schemes after the pandemic. These long-term plans have public engagement built in, so there's a built-in way of accounting for people's opinions there. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and discuss a couple of points on planning for hybrid work. The evidence shows that people aren't leaving cities for the countryside. The movement has been from city centers to suburbs of metropolitan areas, which should have us thinking seriously on measures to prevent active urban sprawl. In more rapidly urbanizing countries, for example, in Nigeria, studies have found that despite desiring flexible work, people are still intending to move to cities where the economic opportunities are. So whether we are talking about rapidly urbanizing areas or the slower growth in the rest of the world, suburbanization and preventing urban sprawl should be very high on our agenda. This gets into spatial planning policies, which can broadly be summed up by compact, mixed-use neighborhoods built around public transport or transit hubs. Alternatively, these principles are those described by the 15-minute city approach and transit-oriented development. And it's important to note that these apply to suburbs as well. Now, most of what I've talked about so far is up to local actors to implement. So I want to close with looking at the role of multi-level governance. The most successful cities during the pandemic, the ones that maintained good transport options and enabled their residents to meet their needs, are the ones that had the support of national and regional governments. We need to invest in these processes and relationships ahead of time. We need to empower local authorities. Cities are spending much more in response to the crisis while simultaneously dealing with a reduced tax base, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the inflation crisis that's going on as well. National governments, on the other hand, can mobilize significant funds that in a way that local governments simply cannot. So, but it's not only about money. Local authorities also need decision-making power, less bureaucratic administrative processes so that they can act quickly. All this will help them do their job well. And lastly, we need to align on policies between levels of government to make sure that we're optimizing our actions. We're seeing this with national governments using public transport supplements as part of their inflation relief measures, which of course supports more sustainable choices, even though the more common approach seems to be rebates on gas or petrol, which of course hinders progress towards the same goal. So we need to make sure we're more aligned. Of course, this requires a much more nuanced discussion than we have time for today. So I will end with the importance of multi-level governance, and I hope that this has provided you with a few ideas on how we can move forward and transform our urban transport systems. Thank you very much, and I'll pass on to Michael now for the questions. I'll keep this slide up though. It summarizes everything we talked about into one slide. So hopefully it'll, jog your memory and spur some questions.
Thank you so much, Malithi. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Very, very interesting, good, and well presented. Stay with us though, because you'll answer the question, not me. I'm just the conduit. I see questions coming in, and now is the time to type in yours if you want to have it treated. The longer you wait, the less the probability. Maybe I can abuse my privilege of having the microphone here to ask the first question, because I was intrigued, Malithi, by what you said about teleworking and commuting. That sort of we tend to assume, I think, that teleworking leads to less commuting, therefore to fewer trips and therefore to less traffic. But you seem to suggest that that's actually not always the case.
Yeah, great question, Michael. Exactly. So we tend to assume that we're just going to have less trips. But what we know is that when people stop traveling for work, oftentimes they'll have additional trips, more local trips that they do during the day, whether it's, to go to the gym or go get groceries, pick up kids, whatnot. And what would really determine whether or not the choices become more sustainable are living locations. So if people stay exactly where they are, and let's say they're living in a city, they're commuting using public transport, and they stop doing so, and therefore they just reduce trips, and maybe they walk to the grocery store or whatnot, that clearly would be more sustainable. However, if people, as a result of their hybrid working or remote working, decide to move to suburbs where maybe they have to adopt a more car-centric lifestyle just based on the services that are available to them, they might be trading in these public transport or walking, cycling trips for ones where they have to use a car to reach the supermarket that's a little bit too far away. So it really depends on kind of your starting condition and your end condition. And if we're going to see suburbanization and greater dependence on cars, there's a chance that we'll actually be generating more travel using less sustainable modes. So it remains to be seen, though. It's just more of a warning that we can't just assume everything's better because of remote work.
So policy incentives count. Malithi, quick question from just a factual question from Alex Blackburn, who says, you mentioned both informal public transport and popular public transport. What's the difference?
It meant that as a synonym. So informal public transport or paratransit is one word that's been used. Popular transport is gaining popularity as a term. Not as many people know about it, which is why I wanted to use both. Popular transport meaning that it is popular, as in it's used by the a greater part of the population, and it tries to to show that it is a legitimate transport mode, and as opposed to perhaps informal has maybe a negative connotation to it, I believe. I'm not an expert on this, but just to say that I meant the same thing. So we're looking at paratransit, informal public transport, or popular transport is kind of the same option.
Mobility options that are not offered as an organized form by the city or the government or corporation. Thank you. Bogdan Kapatsila asks about data, and specifically about gender data. The report provides some findings regarding the safety concerns women have and necessary provisions to address those. Were there other areas for which demographic information was analyzed and maybe didn't result in any findings? Or is this something where there's just a lack of data?
So I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
So are there other demographic information apart from gender-related data that you used and that you looked at?
Yeah, so we looked at a number of different, I guess, user profiles, if you would. So in particular, essential workers being a big kind of important category, and what we find that there's often an overlap within lower income workers, or women are much more represented in kind of the healthcare service industry. So we did look at socioeconomic characterizations, as well as different regions in the world. If you in the report, you'll find there are findings that may not apply to all cities that are part of the global south or global north, kind of more car-centric cities as we have in North America versus kind of denser cities, let's say Tokyo or Singapore.
That's the key word. Leads me to the next question, which comes from Bronwyn Thornton from Walk 21. Hello, Bronwyn, good to have you here. Who asks whether you could be a little more specific about where the biggest changes actually happened geographically, but also in terms of sort of social stratification, and where these changes were most sustained. I think that's where we're getting at the end.
That is a good question. I'm not sure that I can answer that right off the bat here on the biggest changes. I think in comparing regions, I would say that active transport, active travel, this was one of the, I think, the biggest changes that we saw from on kind of a positive side. But what we did find is that in order to kind of quantify these changes, there's a severe lack of data, especially when it comes to walking and cycling as well. And so being able to quantify, great to be able to quantify exactly where the biggest changes happened, but unfortunately we don't have the data. And so I think one of the lessons learned, or one of the recommendations that I didn't get to cover in this presentation, is the importance of data, particularly when it comes to talking about this multimodal system. We have loads of traffic data. We understand what's happening. Public transport operators typically have that data. Shared micromobility providers have that data, but we have very little data on people walking and people using their private mode, micromobility mode of choice. So I would say perhaps use this question to maybe just say that this is one of the biggest recommendations we had, so that we can actually make these kinds of judgments on where the biggest changes happen.
And that's actually a little bit telling, and also sad, years after Walk 21 launched their Making Walking Count campaign, to have some data on walking and on pedestrians. So still a little bit of work to be done there. Naomi Basta asks, which cities would you say are doing particularly well embracing this no new normal approach and planning and are using this decide and provide?
That's a good question. I think there has been a lot of popularity in the UK in different adoption of the kind of decide and provide approach in kind of official government documentation. I don't know exactly on the implementation side, to be honest. I'd have to look into that in more detail. We here in Paris, we're seeing a lot of changes spurred on by the pandemic. I mentioned the terraces. Michael mentioned the kind of uptick in cycling. It's been visible. We're also seeing cities in Latin America who have expanded their cycling networks immensely. And so I think there are examples of it. I don't think that any city is doing it perfectly across all modes of transport, across all different policymaking approaches. But yeah, I would say that there are examples all over.
Thanks very much. Question from Christopher Hodder on urban delivery. Delivery companies, particularly food, did extremely well during the pandemic. They really sort of exploded and were everywhere. Now they're paring back a little bit. Are there also lessons on that side, on the kind of urban deliveries and logistics side for urban the future of urban spaces?
That's a great question, Christopher. It was not the focus of this report, given that we looked at passenger transport. But what I can say is also maybe point you to one of our reports coming out on urban logistics that is dealing with some of these questions and the space that we allot to urban deliveries in terms of their popularity and their drop in popularity now. I guess the lessons we can learn from this are the need to be flexible, the kind of no new normal, accounting for uncertainty. And one of the main ways we can do this is track these kinds of patterns and try and understand what's happening kind of closer to real time, and change our policies and change, our allotment of space, whether it's for delivery vehicles or cargo bikes and whatnot, accordingly.
Right. There are no more open questions at the moment. We still have 4 minutes, so here we have some. From Ignacy Ragas, do you think the 15 minutes concept may lead to gentrification and thus to centrifugate low middle class to suburbs and increase centered mobility?
That's a great question. And I think the fears around the 15-minute city and maybe some of the backlash it has been potentially getting in the media centered around this issue. I think this is very relevant if we choose to make only certain areas 15-minute cities and leave the rest. The whole the intention here when we say 15-minute cities is to ensure that all neighborhoods look like this. So the idea is not to focus on just the urban centers and make it look like this and then say, okay, if you can't afford this, go to the suburbs. We should be seeing elements of this in our development plans for all areas, especially areas where people, have limited resources for transport, and we should not be increasing the affordability there for accessing these services.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And here's one last question, which comes from Dominique Femonville, which is about local government. This was among your final slides, the link between local government and national. Do you consider a high level of local self-government a prerequisite for better and swifter adaptation to a new situation? And maybe you can expand a little bit also on something that you mentioned, which I found very interesting, and that is this question of bringing people on board, which inevitably happens more at that level.
So I think the local self-government, if I'm going to answer it in kind of two different ways. If we mean this idea of bringing people on board and making sure that it's grassroots efforts, I think perhaps it's not always swifter because that does take time, but perhaps it does result in better adaptations that are going to be more successful in the long run if more people are on board. If what we mean by local self-government is perhaps kind of devolution a little bit and not having all the centralized decisions, but rather allowing municipal level decisions for municipal level things like transport, urban transport really is something that cities understand in a kind of more detailed way than national governments typically. So if that is the question, then I think I would say we do need greater support. That is essentially kind of what the report concludes in its last chapter. We need, it'll look different depending on, for example, the European context versus other countries where the governance structures will differ, but overall, we need more funding and more finances available to local governments and the ability to put plans in place using these funds, and therefore having the power to do that. And this isn't just to say that national government should just fund all local government's activities. It needs to go both ways. There needs to be buy-in from both sides. But overall, I would say stronger local governments would result in better urban transport decisions, in my opinion.
Thanks very much. And here we are at the end of this Ask the Author with Malithi. I would like to thank Malithi very, very much for preparing this presentation, for giving very succinct and relevant answers. You'll see on your screen in a second a poll that we always hold at the end of the session, just to find out whether this is actually something that you find useful or not, and help us to get a little bit better. So if you have 2 seconds to answer 2 questions, that'll help us very much to keep this in a format that is useful to you. If I can, in the meanwhile, just summarize the takeaways for me. There may be more, there are more, and they are actually on that slide. But to me, I would say that there is no new normal. We need to move to decide and provide rather than planning for demand that may or may not happen. We need to diversify and decentralize to have a transport system that has everywhere to everywhere. There may be a question of cost is something that needs to be discussed. And we need to move from an approach that provides mobility to an approach that provides access and has a purpose, and that people can reach opportunities, that transport is not for transport's sake. As I said, there may be more. That's what I've taken away from this. Thank you so much. I've put a few links in the chat for the report and also for the presentations. This is being recorded and is live on YouTube. I will send all of you an email with the link so you can look at it again and share it with colleagues who may not have been able to come. And we hope to see you again at the next Ask the Author when we launch our next report, because we do this for all of our reports. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you again to Malithi, and have a very good day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.